Hi there. This is Jim,
And Ralph.
and we welcome you to Psychology Takeaway, where we look at current events in psychology and try and put them into some sort of a perspective that people can use in their own lives. And today we have a guest, Ralph,
We do.
and we also have a very unusual situation here. We've got three Canadians sitting around the microphone. Yep,
As opposed to three Canadians sitting around a coffee mug.
indeed. Our guest is someone that our audience might have heard of from the Terry Fox show that we did, The Power of One. And her name is Amanda.achtman. Hello, Amanda.
Hello, good to be with you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, you say you bounce around a lot, okay? What's a bouncing Canadian like these days?
Well, I'm from Calgary, Alberta, where I grew up, and over the years I've had the opportunity to travel a lot and to study for 4 years in Europe, both in Poland and more recently in Rome. And for the past year, I have been devoted to my mission of preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope all across Canada. Throughout the past year, I based myself in 4 major cities for 3 months each, pivoting from those locations and traveling even more widely than that as I underwent this cultural project to educate Canadians about the euthanasia crisis and to engage Canadians in the big questions of suffering, death, meaning, and hope.
Well, can you define euthanasia for us?
Euthanasia is the intentional ending of a patient's life by a doctor or nurse. And in Canada, euthanasia was legalized in 2016. At the outset, as often happens, there were so-called safeguards, and euthanasia was initially for those who were terminally dying to expedite their life and to end their lives prematurely through this act of a doctor or nurse. Now, in the United States, Americans might be familiar with the term assisted suicide, and there is an important distinction between these.
Physician-assisted suicide.
Right.
Okay.
And in the U.S., the 10 or so states that have assisted suicide require that the person who would be taking the lethal substance take it him or herself. And in Canada, the big difference is that the person has the option to either assisted suicide or euthanasia, the difference being whether they take the lethal substance themselves or have it administered by a doctor or nurse practitioner. And 99.9, I know that sounds like a fishy statistic, but according to the government's own report, almost all deaths are euthanasia because people want the doctor or nurse to do it. It's a kind of outsourcing of the moral weight of the act because the patient can say, well, the doctor or nurse is doing a medical act to me, and the doctor or nurse can say, I'm simply enacting the patient's own will. So there's this mutual outsourcing of responsibility, which is more palatable to almost everyone involved in this process. It's a very strong deterrent to require a person to take his or her own life. And this is how we also see that the euthanasia rates are quickly higher than the ordinary suicide rates in Canada. And that's because it's very difficult for a person to take his or her own life, and understandably so. So we have to mitigate against facilitating suicide. And unfortunately, I'll say very importantly, what I see in Canada is a kind of 2-tier society where some persons get suicide prevention. For example, if I went into the hospital and asked, I would probably be met with, or if I went into the hospital and expressed some form of suicidal ideation, I would immediately, I think, be given some form of suicide prevention and intervention, thankfully. But someone else, someone with maybe a severe disability and who may also be depressed, they would be potentially met with the suggestion that perhaps they would consider medical aid in dying, or MAID, as the euphemism and acronym is in Canada.
Say that again.
Yeah, so in Canada, you almost never hear the term euthanasia. In fact, people will not even necessarily make the connection between euthanasia and MAID, but it's really the same thing. Medical aid in dying. Now, this is important. The language has undergone such a change over the years, and George Orwell known probably to your listeners, wrote this important essay, not only the book 1984 and Animal Farm, but also an important essay titled Politics in the English Language. And in it, he speaks about as language corrupts thought, so too thought can also corrupt language. And we see this with the obfuscation of terms around euthanasia. At first, it might have been called euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Then that was changed to eventually medical aid in dying, and then abbreviated to MAID, M-A-I-D. And what this does is it erodes people's sensitivity to the real act in question.
Sure, I can see medical aid in dying. The medical aid would be to keep me from dying. Right, Ralph?
Yeah. Now, Amanda, dumb question here, but one of the things that I understood, at least in the beginning of the euthanasia movement, was it was designed for people who were in serious health crisis, in terminal pain, which could not be alleviated by drugs, in which they said, I need to die now. Is that, from what you are saying, that still is not, that's not the case now?
This connects 2 points together very well. The point you raised about the chronic pain and terminal illness on the one hand, and this question that you raise about medical aid in dying, what is it really? For a long time, people in palliative care doctors, saw their entire task as providing medical assistance in the dying process.
Right.
Not to hasten death, but to make the person as comfortable as possible,
Pain
to
control.
provide all that, exactly, pain control, to alleviate suffering. Obviously, every person deserves to be met with proper, adequate treatment of their pain as much as medically possible. What we're seeing now is with response to those who are suffering and in pain is the idea that we cannot address it adequately without killing the person.
Wow.
That is tragic, and it's also not true, because by and large, we have the tools in our toolkit, particularly in developed first world countries. How much more capable are we in our countries, thankfully, of providing the pain relief that people need? Now, if we concede and we capitulate to disease and death and instead say, well, you've met a threshold of suffering that qualifies you to die, what does that say to people throughout the developed world who don't have euthanasia, but let alone who don't even have the means of palliative care? By lowering the bar, by lowering the standard, this actually jeopardizes people worldwide because we're conceding to death much earlier. One more very important point on this. People like to say that this is all about choice, but if there's a threshold of pain or if there's a type of illness, pick, for example, ALS. This is one, Lou Gehrig's disease, that's often raised when I'm speaking about this with people. And I say, give me a circumstance in which you think euthanasia might be the right response. And they say, well, I think of this family member or person I knew with ALS, and I saw how much they were suffering, and it was terrible. And so this might be it. And then I say to them, suppose that someone living with ALS has all the same symptoms and discouragement as the person you have in mind, but they don't want to die. As soon as we make euthanasia the answer to a specific disease or condition, we don't really leave everyone free with that same disease or condition not to choose it.
Yeah, we might be pushing, right?
Yeah. It's a devaluing of life.
It's kind of interesting.
The other thing that strikes me is many of the states that do not permit any kind of medical aid in dying say, well, we want to monitor the patient and control their pain up to a point. And then they say, well, if we give them any more drugs, they'll become addicted. And so to me, that is not an answer. It's an artificial conundrum, because if you are terminally ill, what difference does it make if you're addicted to morphine if you're going to die anyway?
Yeah, it's crazy, Ralph. And besides, we're assuming that pain meds are the only way to control pain, but there are all sorts of psychosocial approaches to pain management also.
That's a good point, because the founder of the modern hospice and palliative care movement, Cicely Saunders in the UK, devised this concept more than 50 years ago now of total pain, where she addresses the whole confluence of factors that lead a person to be in pain and anguish. And we know by people's own admission, according to the Government of Canada report on the leading reasons, the leading forms of suffering that lead people to request euthanasia, that the number one reason is not pain or even the fear of pain, not feeling like a burden, not even lack of access to palliative care, not even loneliness. The number one kind of suffering, by people's own admission, that leads them to request euthanasia is a loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. And so it's an existential sorrow. And what are we saying in response to that? And I think this also goes to show that this is not exclusive to the terminally ill or to older people. This is really an existential, it bespeaks a wider existential crisis in our culture.
Well, if we take a look at Maslow's hierarchy, at the very end of life and late adulthood, we've got ego integrity versus despair. And what you're talking about are people who are in despair because they're not leading a meaningful life, right? Now, you've been around the world, you've been around Canada, and you've been interviewing people at various stages of development. And as I have kind of surmised from what I've seen you doing, you're looking at people who are experiencing meaningful lives, right?
Yeah, so
even they might be old and even though they might be sick.
Definitely. And it takes attention to that, because I think in our culture we tend to kind of ghettoize different demographics. There's a lot less intergenerational living, intergenerational solidarity. But I was very blessed to grow up with my grandfather, not just in my life, but really in my family home. Throughout my high school and university years, he lived with my family from the time he was 89 until his death at age 96. And that's a very unique experience to have such an older grandparent in my life, in my home and upbringing. And it really marked me and gave me an attention and curiosity about how people can lead meaningful lives. I want to share a story, though, that I have not even shared yet with anyone because it's so recent.
Okay, go for it.
I went and I sought out a particular author whose book I read and who I so admire for her story. And I was very excited to meet her, and I mounted quite an effort to show up on her doorstep and get to visit her. When we met just these couple days ago, she couldn't remember her book. She couldn't remember her story. And the meeting was kind of confusing to her all around. I didn't know before going to see her that her memory was so affected. But nevertheless, I sought her out. And nevertheless, the encounter was so poignant for me, because here I beheld this woman whose story I so admire, whose book is forging me and giving me a lot of strength and courage, who doesn't even remember the story. And yet I sought her out. Why? Because she has lived a life of meaning and of significance. And even if she cannot recall, nothing can change the fact that she really did those things that I admire or that interested me in going to go seek her out. And I just put that out there because what are we doing in how we live our lives? Who are we becoming? Are we becoming the kind of persons who, even if in the moment we seem to have nothing to give or to offer, that we have forged our identity, that we have developed our personality to such an extent that someone would seek us out to visit us, even if in that moment we seem to have nothing to give them?
Well, we certainly have our humanity, don't we? Ralph and I have parents that have lived to ripe old ages. Well, your dad did, and both my parents did.
And my dad lived with me from the time he was 86 till he died at 93. And there were times that he was a genuine pain in the sit upon, but there were also times that he gave me good advice and obviously cared deeply for me. And
you've been known to be a pain in the sit upon, Ralph.
I have indeed.
Okay, so it doesn't have much to do with age.
Most animals like me, but most people after I talk for a while don't. So
I think these are good points, because being together is hard. And I don't mean to romanticize or gloss over the family relationships and interconnectedness everyone I know and everyone I speak to, and certainly in my own life, it's a struggle. Nevertheless, we know that there's real depth and meaning in being together anyway.
Yeah. I'm making all sorts of gestures here to Ralph because I don't have my glasses, and we've got lots of time here. Okay, so you visited this lady, and she couldn't remember much about what she had written. I sometimes can't remember what I've written yesterday. So, um, can you share her name?
Yeah, so this woman, I'll just say her first name. Her name is Rita, and she worked very hard in her day to try and prevent euthanasia as well.
Okay.
And so she's kind of a role model to me in certain respects. And I just think it's so interesting how I could go seek her out and kind of receive from her a legacy and a witness. And it honestly reminded me of another woman I met similarly, actually the biographer of Dame Cicely Saunders, who I mentioned. Her biographer I similarly sought out in Oxford to hear about her relationship with this founder of the modern palliative care movement. And she too said, forgive me, but I can't remember the book. You read the book on your way here. I wrote it before you were born. And
Right.
so fair enough. And we had this interesting visit. Actually, it was so humorous with this British woman where I would remind her of things in her book and she would say, did I write that? That's rather clever. I got such a kick out of it. But what's striking to me as a young person is the detachment that necessarily comes in old age that doesn't always come easily. We are so much attached to our identity being in what we do, what we accomplish in our work. Me too. And so when I work to prevent euthanasia, I don't see it as an us and them. I see this as a we challenge. We are all concerned and implicated in a society where all of our worth seems to stem from productivity, intelligence. Who is not susceptible to valuing these things inordinately? And yet, when we know, I think particularly by the presence of, for example, people with disabilities, sometimes children who never speak, sometimes people who live long years of memory loss, not only they, but in a particular way, they reveal something true about us that we may be fearful to admit. But I think there's something for us in realizing that our deepest identity does not consist in what we can do, but in who we are, in our capacity to love, and in our createdness to be loved.
Let me ask you a question. You are much younger than Ralph and I. What motivated you to start thinking about death and start thinking about euthanasia and the prevention of and spreading the word about euthanasia?
Sure. Well, there are certainly several things that led to this sense of mission. And when I trace it in my kind of memory, one of the earliest factors is certainly that I had a young brother who died when I was just 2 years old and he was 7 months. And his name was Brandon Joseph. And since he died when I was so young, my parents in particular wanted to make sure that we would remember him as a family, and that eventually my other younger brother who came along, that we would cherish this gift of Brandon and not forget about him. And so we really did that.
Even though he lived for 7 months,
7 months.
He had a life.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that it wasn't just about what he could do, but about what his presence meant in our family life, about how he really mattered. And the way that this was brought home to me was we have home video of his baptism, of his funeral, and of a day in the life at the hospital. And growing up, even in family photos, like my mom got one of those plaques made of his handprint, his tiny handprint, and it's mounted on a wall, and we have all of the children's handprints kind of mounted on the wall. We take off Brandon's handprint mounted plaque and we hold it in our family photos for years growing up to indicate he's really, he's part of our family. And what I like to say is that what I think everyone listening and what you and what we can all relate to is even with people who die, there's a certain sense in which we grow up with them even after they're gone. And I'm sure you can think in your own lives, what's a time where even though they passed away, you almost have new experiences in relation to them after their death.
Good point. You know, I mentioned that we kind of connected you with the Terry Fox story, and we call that the power of one. And that's a good example, I think, of now. Terry Fox has been dead for how long?
Oh, long time.
30 years or so.
More.
Yeah. And yet he's still alive up in Canada. Alive, quotation marks, because they have a Terry Fox Day each
Annual
day.
run, children all across.
Right.
It's one of the most unifying features of our national identity, the Terry Fox story and the Terry Fox run. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to kind of bring this back to euthanasia, was he ever encouraged to end his life, do you think?
I don't think so. I don't think this was on anyone's radar, particularly as a young man showing such endurance and courage and honestly athleticism. On his prosthetic leg, he ran the equivalent of a marathon a day for more than 100
26
days.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And he was raising money for cancer research. Now, cancer is right now the leading underlying condition that leads people to request euthanasia in Canada. For the last year that we have data, 2022, 8,300 persons with cancer chose to end their life prematurely. That is so sad and so kind of defiant of the Terry Fox legacy. And now I just want to share one thing that I come to at the end of that article that you discussed previously, the Our Lives Are a Marathon of Hope article. Now, Terry was an athlete. He had this incredible capacity to run with this endurance. But when he was asked what his most inspiring moment was, it wasn't really about the running. His favorite day, his most memorable day he had was a day he took off. And he spent the day swimming with a boy of about 10 or 11 who had a prosthetic leg just like he did. And they went swimming together. And he says, I've never been more inspired in my life. And that this is what it's all about. Why? Because he was able to say to that boy, I'm with you. You're with me. We're in this. And so whatever happens, life and suffering is bearable because we're not alone.
We'll put that article back up with this interview because Ralph and I have a connection with the picture that you have with the article. We know that place. It's called 1 Mile Hill, or is it 3 Mile Hill, Ralph?
3 Mile Hill. Yeah.
It's just north of Sault Ste. Marie, where we grew up. And we've tackled that hill ourselves. And
walked and ran it uphill and down.
Not at the end of 26 miles, however.
But, you know, Amanda, here's a question for you. The first thing that doctors and nurses take is some version of the Hippocratic Oath.
Do no harm.
First, do no harm. And how do we square what's going on in Canada and creeping into the U.S. with the physician's oath or the nurse's oath?
Well, it's quite simple. It's through an inversion of the meaning of harm, so that I have read a memoir of a euthanasia doctor in Canada, and she specifically addresses the Hippocratic Oath and says, in fact, I think I would be doing harm not to kill my patient, not to prematurely end their life. Because they are suffering, she says, the underlying condition is what's killing them. I'm simply relieving their suffering by putting them out of their misery. And so through this inversion of what constitutes harm, you can turn anything around and say it would be harmful not to end their life. It would be harmful, and we could go on a whole host of
That's
practices.
a doublethink stuff that you were talking about with George Orwell. We should put a reference to that on. Can you dig that out?
All pigs is equal, but some pigs is more equal than others.
There's that one. What was the name of the article again?
Politics in the English Language. It's a short essay, and the full thing is available online.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll dig that one up. Well, this has been a very enlightening conversation, Amanda.
It's good to be with you here.
Right here. And we're not in our palatial university studio. We're in a palatial cabin by the lake. And so you've just arrived here. You worked all day. We're going to let you go and have fun with the little girls who inhabit this place.
It's great to be visiting friends and enjoying the lake and spending some summer time with dear friends who I first spent a lot of time with in Rome. And now we can be together again. It's the perfect way to spend July in Michigan. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as usual, Ralph, we are going to say, hey, if you want, buy the boys a coffee. Take a look at our online courses. If you have any questions, send us an email. But until the next time, this is Jim
And Ralph
saying, keep your stick on the ice, because we're all in this
together.
together.